Hey, I'm Nathan Benaich, and this talk I'm going to present on privacy and AI for startups. I'm founder and general partner of Air Capital, which is a venture capital firm investing in AI-first technology and life science companies. I'm also founder and managing trustee of the Rise Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization that supports open source education and research in AI for the common good. And OpenMined is one of the projects that we support. And I'm also co-author of the annual State of AI report that analyzes the most interesting trends in AI. So the question I'm going to start off with is whether privacy is the next chapter for AI for startups. And so let's consider two paradigms for machine learning in industry. The first is centralized, which is what large technology companies operate today. And decentralized is where we have a network of participants that are essentially operating in a federation. And so when we look at the question of data ownership, for centralized companies, data is essentially owned by them. Users are essentially okay with sharing their data to a centralized provider in exchange for the application that they offer. In the decentralized setting, data is owned by each creator that's part of that federation. When it comes to model ownership, in this case, a machine learning model that maybe does photo predictions, in the centralized setting, that model is owned by the centralized provider that builds it and serves it through their app. In the decentralized setting, that model could be owned by every single creator. When it comes to computing infrastructure, centralized companies, of course, benefit from significant economies of scale because they serve millions or sometimes billions of users using that same infrastructure that they own and operate. Whereas in the decentralized setting, the computing infrastructure is provided by every node within that federation. When it comes to private data sharing, it's generally not possible or not offered in the decentralized setting. Whereas in the decentralized setting, you can offer privacy-preserving sharing. And projects like OpenMined facilitate that. And lastly, when we look at the power dynamics, in the centralized setting, it's really the whales that win. It's the large companies that can amass all these resources under one roof. And then the decentralized setting, the power dynamics are shifted towards the long tail of many, many small participants that, when summed together, are worth more than the parts. So the implications for this are really that in the past, or in the centralized setting, those who win are essentially the companies that amass all these private resources together under one roof. And if we look at the decentralized setting, the real opportunity is the ability to answer questions using data that you can't see. So taking that, why would one build a privacy-preserving software product in the first place? Well, one obvious reason is whether your customers would just not use or not pay for your product if it wouldn't preserve their privacy. So to illustrate this example, we can look at the smartphone market, where some companies don't provide privacy guarantees over the data that's generated and stored on a user device, and other companies like Apple put privacy front and center. And so they famously say, what happens on your iPhone stays on your iPhone. And many consumers will buy that device because of these privacy guarantees. Another example is whether your customers just fundamentally believe that the product they use delivers a superior performance and experience because it has native privacy baked in. And so an example here is the Brave browser, which is Chrome-based, so familiar to everybody who uses Chrome, but significantly faster, offering native ad blocking, and therefore more privacy. And that company now has about 6 million daily active users. Another reason to build privacy-preserving software is because the problem that you're trying to solve just wouldn't be solvable without a privacy-first approach. So the best example of this that's topical today is COVID-19 track and trace applications, where many individuals in various democratic societies actually think that the privacy burden that's imposed by these kinds of applications is unacceptably high. And so if these companies and governments cannot guarantee the privacy of location data and other related data as it relates to COVID, then users are unlikely to adopt these apps. An interesting reason to build a privacy-preserving product is in the case that it actually facilitates product distribution or improves your customer acquisition strategy, or even provides a brand new value proposition altogether. To illustrate this example, here I'm showing ErasurePay, which is a marketplace for information. And so here on the demand side, somebody can submit a request for a unique data set that someone around the world maybe has access to. And they can provide a reward and a stake in a pseudonymous fashion and get submissions from the supply side. So here, privacy is really unlocking access to data that otherwise wouldn't be traded because maybe the marginal cost of trading it would be too high. And lastly, one of the areas that I think is quite interesting is whether the business that you're operating in a privacy-preserving fashion has demonstrated better unit economics or financial performance than to operate that same business in a non-privacy-preserving setting. And this, I think, is just right now TBD. So taking all this together, why might you be right to choose to build a privacy by design product today? Well, the most obvious reason is that consumers are aware that their data is being captured by companies around the world. But the important thing here is that the industry in which those companies are will affect whether consumers are happy sharing their data or not. And so generally speaking, companies that are operating in healthcare or in financial services have less problem with the perception that they capture data than companies in technology or media and entertainment, where users are not so happy that those businesses capture data. And here I think the underlying assumption is that people cannot be treated in hospitals if they don't share data about their condition, and people cannot get access to financial products if they don't share access about data about their financial situation. Whereas you could probably consume media on the internet without necessarily telling the internet provider who you are. The second reason is that GDPR has come into place and huge fines are being levied on companies that are succumbing to data breaches or do not have significant transparency towards their consumers. And so fines ranging from tens to hundreds of millions of euros have been levied on businesses like British Airways or Marriott or Google for leaking customer data or for not being transparent towards their consumers. So while these numbers are important and maybe look high, they're unfortunately just a drop in the ocean when it comes to the revenues that these businesses generate every year. Another important reason for privacy by design is just the creepy factor. Many customers of social media products just feel like the ads are just too accurate, or even not necessarily too accurate, but are actually just listening to conversations that they might have in their microphone when they're not actually even using the product. And so this kind of customer perception that social media products are tracking you and listening to you and using that data to personalize advertising is generating a kind of ambiance where consumers are not happy using these services anymore. So many of them still do because they're just designed to be addictive. But I think it's an interesting tailwind for why privacy by design might actually take hold. And then there's, of course, the regulatory reason, where in Europe, GDPR, and in California, CCPA mandates you to be more observant over how you treat customer data. And by 2018, about $8 billion was spent by companies just in terms of compliance. To draw an analogy on products that are actually working really well, being private by design, here I show you the inflection point in queries per million for DuckDuckGo, which is a private search engine. And so this search engine natively blocks network tracking, provides encryption, and it means that you can search the internet without being tracked and without your search queries being used to target advertising. So consumers seem to really like this, as you can see with the chart on the right. But having said all this, why might privacy by design be too early today? Well, one notion is that actually the definition of privacy is quite hard to cement in stone in a way that's generally applicable to everybody around the world. Different cultures will have different sensitivity levels for what they deem to be private or non-private. And so this kind of difference in tolerance makes it very difficult to design a technology product that can be used by millions of people or billions of people in the same way. And so to illustrate this point, I take a graph in this book called The Culture Map, which looks at how cultures of people from different nationalities in the workplace really differs. So you can see that some nationalities, for example, are highly emotionally expressive and generally like to avoid confrontation, whereas other nationalities generally like confrontation but are emotionally unexpressive. And so taking into account the culture and people's different definition and notion of privacy is an important factor when building products that millions or billions of people will use. Another important reason why privacy by design might be too early is just because consumers still don't really understand their rights or data privacy regulations. And here I'm showing you a stat from a survey of about 290,000 global consumers after GDPR came into effect. And they were asked whether they feel that they have a better understanding of how customers use their data. 55% of them just said no. And this is not entirely unsurprising because companies around the world publish privacy policies that are supposed to educate users on how they process data, what kind of data they capture, and how long they store it. But these privacy policies are just so difficult to read and way too long. So consumers can barely even parse the information that's in them. And I really challenge you to think about the last time that you've actually read a privacy policy when you use a product on the internet. And so how can we expect that consumers understand privacy when they're so hard to parse? So in this chart, I'm showing you an illustration of privacy policies from different companies. Some of these are media businesses, some of them are social networks, some of them are transportation apps. And you can see that the vast majority of them are extremely hard to read and generally would require a college degree or a professional career. So how is this okay when there are a billion people on the internet and not everybody has a college degree or a professional career? As a side note here, I want to give a shout out to some folks who publish a really legible privacy policy, one that's quite graphically easy to understand and grasp what data we give and what data they collect and what they collect it for. And so this is a snapshot of the privacy policy that I talk about from Juro. You can access it at juro.com. And another reason why privacy by design might be too early is just that the technology isn't quite ready, and generally products that have tried to build privacy-preserving social networks, as an example, haven't really stuck. And so here is an excerpt from a post from Mark Zuckerberg about a year and a half ago, which described a privacy-focused vision for social networking. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of this is still work to be done. So what's happening today? So here I'm going to walk through a couple of examples of startups that are using various methods for privacy-preserving machine learning or data processing in different sectors. The first sector that I see a lot of is healthcare and life sciences. So these are startups that are either using federated learning or private data sharing in order to help hospitals share clinical trial results, or share medical analyses, or share data sets of medical imaging, with the overall goal to deliver better patient care. And they use these kinds of privacy-preserving techniques because one can generally not share data about human health conditions without patient consent. And in general, that information is very challenging to capture, very expensive to capture, and includes personal information. So if we can overall create a network where the information is shared, but not the privacy, the sort of like topics that are very important for privacy, then we can overall deliver better patient care. The second area is with synthetic data. And so here the idea is we'd like to have participants help us solve a problem on data that we have. But again, we can't share that data for legal or for competitive reasons. And so there's some interesting machine learning methods that can be used to synthesize essentially copies of the data in a way that preserves the statistical distribution of the source data, but doesn't disclose the exact original points. And so ML models can be trained on the synthetic data that can then be reused on the private data from the company. And the third area is, in generally speaking, enterprise software for privacy components or compliance, which provides sort of out-of-the-box compliance sort of products that businesses can use in order to be compliant or to offer better privacy guarantees to their users. So these kinds of products are really useful to help overall level the playing field or increase the level of privacy across the entire network of software companies. And so to conclude, I think the real opportunity here is twofold. The first is this idea of federated data, which is really about unlocking data that harbors untapped signal. And the next step from that is this idea of federated intelligence, which is taking all this data that was previously locked up or not able to be shared for a variety of reasons, using privacy-preserving methods to unlock that data, and aggregate all of it into a common experience set that can be shared with all the participants in order to level up their experience. So here you can take the example of fighting cybercrime, where many different businesses face cybercrime every day, but they don't necessarily want to disclose the fact that they're experiencing cybercrime because that's bad for their reputation or various other reasons. But all businesses that are susceptible to cybercrime would benefit from understanding the trends across their peers. And so using federated data and federated intelligence can essentially provide a way that preserves privacy, but that exposes this kind of aggregate experience to all participants. And the key thing I want to leave you with is that you should not forget that taking a product and adding privacy is just not enough. And there have been many examples in the past that show that the only way to replace incumbents is by beating them by a very, very wide margin. And so take an example here from a completely different segment, but one that's very much the David and Goliath battle that I talk about, is Mission Barns, which is a Airstreet portfolio company that's essentially invented a new way to make meat that does not involve slaughtering animals. And so this is in the segment of clean meat, cell-based meat. And what's amazing here is that it actually developed a product that has essentially taste and texture parity with bacon, but provides a number of benefits over real bacon, which is no foodborne illnesses, no toxic contaminants, no trans fats, no antibiotics, and no slaughtered animals. And so this is a way that you can actually replace an incumbent, provide the same product, but 10x better. So if you'd like to learn more about some of the work that we do and the events that we run and content that we share, I encourage you to head to rise.co, which is our Research and Applied AI Summit, which in the past has hosted a variety of talks on privacy-preserving machine learning, federated learning, which you can find on YouTube. We share a variety of learnings on building AI for startups on our blog, which is airstreet.com/blog, and a variety of other resources at guide2.ai. Of course, I'd love to chat to you and discuss research and startups and anything else that's on your mind. You can reach me on Twitter at Nathan Benaich and on Telegram at Airstreet. So with that, thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to meeting you at the conference.